Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the Senator from Minnesota for his very powerful and eloquent words, and particularly thank my distinguished friend and colleague from Rhode Island for his leadership on this issue, but also to thank others who have been at his side and working with him. I've been proud to do so as a co-sponsor of this measure, and to thank Senator Schumer, who introduced a similar measure in 2010. The Disclose Act of 2010, in fact, has been considerably narrowed and tailored to target the anonymity of huge donations, increasingly large donations today. And the kind of tailoring and narrowing reflects the care and precision and hard work that my colleague from Rhode Island and others, and I'm proud to be among them, have given to this matter. As I rise at this late hour, we can't know, we can only hope that America is listening or that our colleagues are listening. But I do know that we should be listening to America. I am listening to Connecticut. And what I hear from Connecticut, the people of my state, as so many of my colleagues are hearing from their constituents and citizens, is they are losing trust in the greatest democracy in the history of the world. The greatest country in the history of the planet is losing the confidence and faith of its people. I'm hearing from people like Catherine Sturgis of New Canaan, Connecticut, who says undisclosed campaign money influences candidates, elections, and determines the role of the voter. In turn, the election process is corrupted. Only a few cannot be allowed to impact a system which is intended to represent us all. Lawrence Point of Fairfield tells me, and I'm listening, right now, foreign governments, oil tycoons, and Wall Street Bank can spread millions to buy our democracy, and the American public will never know. And I'm listening also to Garrett Timmons of Brooklyn, Connecticut, who says, I think campaign and election reform should go much further and include a constitutional amendment in light of Citizens United, but I know how unrealistic that is. At least this act, he's referring to the Disclose Act of 2012, is a step in the right direction, and I hope a no-brainer for Congress. The people of this country are losing their representation in government to special interests and the funders of political campaigns. And to make matters worse, we don't even know who are stealing our election. I'm listening to those people who are watching. They are watching what's happening in this country, and they are losing faith because they feel Washington is failing to listen to them. And millions of other hardworking families who are struggling to put food on the table, stay in their homes, find jobs, and feel that the system is working for them and listening to them as much as it is the people who can afford to give to political campaigns, let alone who can afford to give tens of millions. If we listen to the people of America, and I am listening to the people of Connecticut, we will pass the Disclose Act of 2012. All that it requires is openness and disclosure and accountability. It places no limits on what can be contributed, on what can be done, on what can be said. It is completely consistent with Citizens United. I'm not here to relitigate that case. The Supreme Court in the Bullock decision recently indicated it won't relitigate that case anytime soon. It invalidated a Montana state law that prohibited corporations from making independent expenditures. We're not going to relitigate the question of whether a corporation is a citizen, whether any of these entities can contribute or in what amounts. The Disclose Act of 2012 is completely consistent with Citizens United. In fact, in a certain very true sense, Citizens United, in its majority opinion, presumed disclosure. The Supreme Court said, the majority opinion in that case made clear the First Amendment protects political speech, and I'm quoting, and disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. The framework, the reasoning, the logic of Citizens United is no limits on speech, but disclosure of who is speaking and who is funding and supporting that speech. That basic premise is one that runs through the precedents of this court and of others that have litigated these cases. And it's not too much to say that the Disclose Act of 2012 is an essential predicate to the framework, the legal framework that Citizens United presumes. Now, I would rather go further as well. As one of my constituents said, I would favor a constitutional amendment that will enable some limits consistent with the Constitution. Money is corrosive. Too much money in the system corrupts. But again, we're not here to set limits. We're here to deal with secrecy, with anonymity. Secrecy and anonymity not only corrode, they destroy the essence of our democracy. And by opening the system to the sunshine that will eliminate that secrecy, we are helping to restore trust and faith in government, and we would be showing that Washington will listen to the American people, including the people of Connecticut. Supreme Court decisions, like elections, have consequences, and Citizens United certainly has shown that it has consequences. During the 2010 midterm elections, the first election season after Citizens United, outside groups spent nearly $300 million, 4 times as much money as in the 2006 midterm elections before the Citizens United decision. Nearly half of the money spent in the 2010 elections after Citizens United was decided was spent by just 10 groups. Think of it, 10 groups spent more than half of that $300 million. And as spending has quadrupled, transparency has been lessened. Nobody knows where this money is coming from. In 2006, only 1% of political spending by outside groups was anonymous. In 2010, 44%, nearly half, was anonymous. Now, we know anonymity on the Internet or in the public sphere breeds negativism, it breeds deception, and often it breeds outright lies. Accountability is one of the watchwords of our democracy. And the anonymity of this spending, of these contributions, of the tens of millions, indeed hundreds of millions of dollars that are contributed by a handful of people and entities, whether it's corporations or business association or union, is corrupting to the process. The majority opinion in Citizens United dismissed concerns about unlimited political spending by claiming that prompt disclosure would make these entities and individuals accountable to shareholders, voters, consumers, the public at large. And yet, elections have been inundated with secret money. Citizens United had consequences unintended and unanticipated by the Supreme Court. People may say, well, the justices were naive, but the fact of the matter is this body, the Congress, must compensate to ameliorate and remedy the unintended consequences of that decision. The American people have shown in polls, as well as those letters that I mentioned earlier, that they expect us to do so. 7 in 10 Americans believe that super PACs should be illegal, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. This issue is not partisan. It should be bipartisan. It has been bipartisan in the past and must be again. More than 7 in 10 Americans feel there is too much money in politics, including, again, the majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. 7 in 10 Americans, including majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, believe there should be limits on contributions to political campaigns. 1 in 4 Americans say they are less likely to vote. Less likely to vote because of super PACs and these anonymous donations. And finally, 7 in 10 Americans agree, and I'm quoting, new rules that let corporations, unions, and people give unlimited money to super PACs will lead to corruption. Let the Senate listen to the people of Connecticut and America. Let them say, we respect what you are saying again and again and again, and we will act in a bipartisan way to protect our democracy. Americans want their choice of candidates to be an election, not an auction. At the very least, we should tell them and make possible for them to know who is doing the bidding in those auctions, who is doing the buying, and who is doing the selling. Nobody wants there to be an auction. But if contributions are not limited, the auction at the very least should be in the open so that the public can see who is buying, who is selling, who is bidding. That view of American democracy may not be a very elevating one, but we deal with practical reality here. And as we speak, tens of millions of Americans are watching what we will do, maybe not tonight, perhaps not at this hour, but at the end of the day, at the end of this debate, they will hold the United States Senate accountable for what it does or what it fails to do, and I urge my colleagues to reconsider and approve the Disclose Act of 2012. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues in supporting the Disclose Act. I want to commend Senator Blumenthal for his extraordinarily insightful and articulate words with respect to this critical issue. I particularly want to commend my colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse. He has been the driving force to bring this issue to the floor, to educate all of us in the Senate and the American people about what is at stake here. And in many respects, it's our democracy. It's the presumption that every American has that their vote counts just as much as anybody else's vote, that elections are decided based upon issues and ideas and not the sheer volume and the sheer magnitude of 30-second advertisements, which are designed more to divert than to inform, designed more to excite than to inform. most people believe in the system which is based upon thoughtful consideration of ideas and issues, and everyone's vote counts. Senator Whitehouse is an extraordinarily gifted attorney. He understands these issues perhaps as well as anyone in this body. He was our federal attorney and our attorney general, and he's brought this not just knowledge of the Constitution, but this passion for justice and fairness and decency and democracy to the forefront of our debate today. And this will not be the last day, I think, we will be debating this issue. So let me begin by commending his efforts. A fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution is the right to vote. And each citizen gets one vote, and this right represents a critical pillar of our democracy, because we treat everyone equally in allowing each citizen to have this crucial and critical say in who governs, what are the issues, ultimately what is the course of this great country. But I worry, because of the Supreme Court decisions in Citizens United, that our political and civic conversations now advantage those who flood our airwaves, papers, and websites by talking, if not shouting, louder, simply because they have more money and resources to do so. The New York Times recently included the following in an article giving us one indication of how much money is awash in our political system, and it reflects what my colleague from Connecticut said. According to the Times, quote, during the 2010 midterm elections, tax-exempt groups outspent PACs, the traditional political action committees which have been in effect since the 70s, by a 3-2 margin, according to a recent study by the Center for Responsive Politics and the Center for Public Integrity, with most of that money devoted to attacking Democrats or defending Republicans. And such groups have accounted for 2/3 of the political advertising bought by the biggest outside spenders so far in the 2012 election cycle, according to Kantar Media's Campaign Media Analysis Group, with close to $100 million in issue ads. Small group of anonymous individuals organized as corporate entities, not-for-profit corporate entities in some cases, $100 million. And the clock is still ticking and the amount is accumulating. That electioneering in the shadows is not what most Americans want. They want robust debate. They want candidates to engage as candidates, not through surrogates, not the witting or unwitting beneficiaries or victims of anonymous advertisements in their state, in their race. This is not, I believe, what the creators of the Constitution thought would happen or hoped would happen. They envisioned, I think, one in which the best ideas, the best arguments prevailed, regardless of how loudly one spoke, that it was the quality of the argument, not the volume of the speaker. And what should be important is this quality of speech, not the quantity. And frankly, there's a direct correlation between the amount of money you have today and the quantity of your speech on the media. That's just the reality of paid advertising, which dominates political campaigns. But this vision, because of Citizens United, I think has been turned on its head. Now those with the greatest resources, the most money, have been given a disproportionate advantage. And they've been given that advantage without the need to stand up to be accountable, to be known, to disclose what they've done, what they stand for, where the money's coming from, basically. And that anonymity is corrosive. By allowing corporations and unions and not-for-profits to unleash the full power of their Treasury funds and explicitly advocating for the election or defeat of candidates in federal and state elections in the name of protecting and promoting free speech, I think the Supreme Court missed the mark. Missed the mark about the centrality of an individual's vote and the substance of a campaign being about ideas, not about derogatory advertising, not about anything else except the issues. That's the ideal. That's what our founding fathers were hoping for, and indeed, I think, expecting. And that, I think, has been terribly distorted by this opinion. There's an interesting sort of situation going on here. In the attempt to create, under Citizens United, what the Supreme Court, I expected, was hoping to do, create an atmosphere in which speech is free, they've created a situation in which speech is no longer free. Effective speech is no longer free. It actually comes with a very high cost and goes to the person who is the highest bidder. That's not free speech, not effective free speech. It's purchase speech. And if our elections are going to be decided not by free speech but by purchase speech, they'll be won always by the highest bidder, by the person with the biggest wallet, the person who's willing to spend as much as necessary to prevail. And it will raise, and it does raise, the specter of, is this about the future of the country, or is this about the narrow self-interest of someone who's willing to invest a great deal of money into a particular race? And I think most people would conclude it's probably about the narrow self-interest of someone who invests a great deal of money in a race. Simply put, I think Citizens United is deeply flawed, and more than one expert has voiced their frustration and disappointment with this decision. Shortly after the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Citizens United in 2010, Norm Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right, more right than center perhaps, organization, wrote in a column in Roll Call called, quote, "Court way oversteps its authority with Citizens United's case," these words: "I hoped," he said, "Citizens United would be decided narrowly, but feared that the court would take a meat axe to a century of settled law and policy. My worst fears were realized. This decision equates corporations which have one goal, to make money, with individual citizens who have many goals and motives in their lives, including making a better society, protecting their children and grandchildren and future generations, and so on and so on. This was a case never raised by the plaintiffs and never formally brought before the Roberts Court. We do not have an instance where an actual for-profit corporation has complained that it has been barred from its ability to get its message across in the political process. The cases overturned and the laws struck down were considered carefully by judges and Congresses past, including in the McConnell decision barely 6 years ago. Only one thing has changed since: the political and ideological complexion of the Supreme Court, brought on in particular by the retirement of Sandra Day O'Connor. And those are the words of Norm Ornstein, one of the most respected political analysts in this community, and indeed probably in this nation. Additionally, Judge Richard Posner, a respected judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, who was appointed to the bench by President Ronald Reagan, recently stated the following on his blog: "The court, rather naively as it seems to most observers, reasoned in Citizens United case that the risks of corruption would be slight if the donor was not contributing to a candidate or a political party, but merely expressing his political preferences through an independent organization such as a super PAC, an organization neither controlled by nor even coordinating with a candidate or political party." He goes on, It thus is difficult to see what practical difference there is between super PAC donations and direct campaign donations from a corruption standpoint. A super PAC is a valuable weapon for a campaign, as the heavy expenditures of Restore Our Future, the large super PAC that supports Romney and has attacked his opponents, proves. The donors to it are known, and it is unclear why they should expect less quid pro quo from their favorite candidate if he's successful than a direct donor to the candidate's campaign would be. Now, Judge Posner, I think, is making the case very effectively. You know, if there are limits on a direct individual donor's contributions, because there is an abiding suspicion, and the courts have confirmed, that you don't even want to create the appearance of a quid pro quo, the idea that a super PAC whose donors are all known has less of an ability to influence a candidate and more, I think, significantly, not only a candidate, but perhaps an elected official, that doesn't follow. I think Judge Parsons' comments are very on point in that this also invites the perception and perhaps the reality of inappropriate influence on candidates and on elected officials. And that was at a great deal at the heart of why we passed campaign reform legislation decades ago. Now, even these point of view by Noam Ornstein, by Judge Posner, have not, unfortunately, convinced my Republican colleagues to join us, in effect, in trying to correct the deficiency, which my able colleague from Connecticut pointed out, was the fact that the case of citizens presumes this disclosure. We have tried to debate this legislation and variations many times before. We have taken even much more, I think, stronger action in previous versions. But today we're here in a good faith effort to meet our colleagues more than halfway. There are those who oppose previous versions of the Disclose Act on the grounds that there were provisions unrelated to disclosure, that this is all about disclosure. But these concerns are addressed head-on in this legislation crafted by my colleague, because it focuses solely on disclosure, and it is effective after this fall's election. And so I would ask my colleagues, especially those who have said that they're all for disclosure, to join us to pass this legislation, because it's all about disclosure. And let me go back to the language of the Supreme Court majority opinion quoted by Senator Blumenthal, because they presume in the decision there would be full disclosure. And that's what we're asking for tonight on this floor. Give the court what it thought it had, a system by which the American public can know immediately who is putting all this money into the elections. In their words, prompt disclosure of the court in Citizens United. Prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporate's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are, quote, in the pocket, close quote, of so-called moneyed interests. The First Amendment protects political speech, and disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. This transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. That's what the court said. And yet, if we don't pass this legislation, all of this is irrelevant, because there is no disclosure, because corporations can't make judgments about what their directors are investing in terms of political activities. Individuals can't make judgments about the commercials they're seeing because they don't know who is behind them, really. So if we want to create the context which presumably undergirded the Supreme Court's decision, we have to pass this legislation. But if we want to ignore, indeed, what the court has said, ignore what our constituents have said, and allow this anonymous money to flood our elections, to raise doubt about the process, to undercut what traditionally people think is the American way, one person, one vote, it's about the issues, and let's have the election. So I urge my colleagues to support the Disclose Act. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise tonight to join what so many have spoken of tonight, which is about our system of electing officials to various levels of government. In the case of the federal government, we're always concerned about how that process plays out. We live in a country where, for generations now, we've urged people to come to the public square, in a sense, to vote, to participate, to use their free speech rights, their freedom of association, the rights they have to participate in elections. And what we're confronted with now, without the passage or in the absence of the passage of this legislation, is what I would say are special rules for secret money, or maybe better said, special rules for a small group of individuals or entities to spend secret money. We have in Pennsylvania, as one of the buildings in the Capitol area, where right next to the Capitol, the Finance Building. It's a building I worked in for a decade. And when it was built in the 30s, they had inscriptions around the border, the perimeter, so to speak, of the top of the building, precepts about government, about what it should be, so that people that worked in that building would aspire to higher ideals. And one of the inscriptions says the following. It says, "Open to every inspection, secure from every suspicion." A pretty simple precept. And I think we all understand what that means, that if you have a system or a candidate or an organization or a process that's open to inspection, the chances of there being suspicion about that candidate or about that process or about that organization would be diminished. So more disclosure, more scrutiny. We all know the old expression, I'm not quite sure who said this, but we've all used this, the idea of sunlight being the best disinfectant to make sure that we keep the processes, our political process open. And it's baffling to me why someone would not want to vote for this legislation when you consider the language. It's a piece of legislation which is just barely gets to the 20th page. It's not very long. But I was looking at page 5 where the authors of the bill, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who's done great work on this, and so many others who worked with him. The language on page 5 says as follows. It's under the title Disclosure Statement. Very simple language. Any covered organization, and of course they define that makes campaign-related disbursements aggregating more than $10,000 in an election reporting cycle shall, and this is the mandatory part, not later than 24 hours after each disclosure date, file a statement with the Federal Election Commission made under penalty of perjury that contains information described in paragraph 2. And then it goes on to describe what you have to disclose. Very simple. I don't know how you could be opposed to that. If you believe in debates in the public square, it's not as if we say to people, come to the public square, but a few of you can go into a corner, we're going to cloak you in secrecy, and you're going to be in the shadows. Everyone else in the public square is going to know who's on the square, is going to know what your point of view is, what your position is in the debate. But there are a couple of others we're going to put in the shadows, and the rest of you won't know who they are, but don't worry about it. That sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very American. I think that when people see what happened in the last couple of years, they're very concerned that we've got a system now that has too much of this secret money, too much money in the shadows without the sunlight providing the disinfectant. And when you consider what we're doing now and compare it to what's happened over the last generation, where candidates not only file reports about who's contributed to their campaigns, but even their advertising. They have disclaimers at the bottom of the advertising. And now, in the more recent period, the candidate himself or herself has to identify themselves by name and say that they paid for the ad. This legislation doesn't even get to that. It really focuses on the basic question of disclosure, so that a citizen can say, okay, well, this organization made this assertion in an advertisement, and I'm going to find out who they are, so I can make a judgment about the advertisement before I vote. It's very simple. It's how our system works. People go to the public square, they have a debate, There's a lot of sunlight, a lot of disclosure, and the debates are freewheeling, and they're tough, but they're in the open, and they comply with that precept that I started with. They're open to every inspection, and therefore the chances of suspicion are lessened because everything's out in the open. That's all this is, providing a measure or a degree of sunlight into that process, into that public square. So if all these generations of reform have told us, which I think they have told us, and I know this is true in Pennsylvania, that more disclosure, more sunlight, more scrutiny is going to lead to better elections and better participation, I don't think we should run counter to that history. So I'm not trying to assert that everything else about our elections is perfect. We still have a lot of other reforms we could institute. But at least we can give people some measure of confidence that when they hear an assertion in that public square, that they're going to know where it comes from. They're going to know the origin of that statement. They're going to know the bias or point of view, and they're going to make a judgment about that before they exercise their right to vote. We should allow people that opportunity to maybe be a little suspicious, but it's hard to be secure in your knowledge about information if you don't know where it comes from. You don't know who is the real speaker, and you don't know their point of view. So I think there are a lot of Americans that know that our system isn't perfect even with passage of this legislation, but they would at least say to us, let's at least remove the possibility, which I think is evident now, that you've got a small group of people that are allowed to spend this secret money and therefore elevate or raise suspicion and maybe even cynicism about our system. So let's be open to every inspection and to every measure of scrutiny, and let's bring our point of view to the public square like we have for so many generations. Let's pass the Disclose Act and make sure that at a minimum, as tough as times are for a lot of people right now, that at least they're going to have the information they need about a point of view before they vote. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The senator from New York.
Thank you, Mr. President. And late. Forgot about the microphone. And first, I want to thank all of my colleagues who have been so diligent, hardworking, and just prescient on this issue. Of course, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, the leader of our task force that led us to this point. Senator Merkley has been very active and involved, as have you, Mr. President. Senator Shaheen, Senator Bennett. So many people on the task force did a very, very good job, Senator Udall as well. And so did so many of our colleagues. The fact that we've been on the floor now for close to 5 hours and there hasn't been a moment's pause says something. It talks about the broad support that this modest but powerful act has on our side of the aisle. The fact that no one, unfortunately, on the other side of the aisle has come to debate this issue says something as well. The only debate, in fact, we heard was the Republican leader in a brief speech in an argument that was sort of almost 1984-ish, that the reason we shouldn't disclose is that people who give would be harassed. Well, by that, we should probably have everything be in secret. Because, of course, in an open democracy, when you do things in the political arena, you're subject to criticism. That is what freedom is about. And now to come up with this inside-out argument that we shouldn't disclose because people might be criticized for the contributions they make or the ads they fund? That is the most anti-democratic, anti-U.S. Constitution argument that I have heard. It just doesn't even pass the laugh test, and I'm surprised. My colleague is one of the most brilliant political minds we have around here. Even when I disagree with him, I respect his mind. But this argument is, to say it's sophistry is kind, and I don't think it's going to catch on with people. Anyway, we've had very few comments other than that made by colleagues on the other side of the aisle here tonight, and that is truly unfortunate, truly unfortunate. We should have a debate on this issue. But I have a feeling most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle realize by their previous statements, by the previous position of the Republican Party, and just by knowing them that we're right. Disclosing contributions is only fair and only right and only American and only in keeping with our democracy and our Constitution. And I think the reason so few people have shown, or no people have shown on the other side, is that the reason that they're not supporting us is not out of conviction, but out of short-term political advantage. Because obviously the super PACs, large multi-million-dollar contributions are coming mostly from the other side and may indeed benefit them in the election. But in the long run, it's bad for our democracy. In the long run, I would argue it's bad for the Republican Party to shy away from not only debating this issue but supporting this bill, because the issue of disclosure is so simple and so easy and so right. The issue of disclosure is one that's now racking the presidential campaign, and you can run, but you can't hide. The argument of disclosure will, in a sense, chase you down and beat you. So you may as well join in now and do the right thing. Now, I'd like to make a point here. The two top advertisers in this election cycle are predictably the two candidates' campaigns. What's the third? Just after the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign. It is something called Crossroads GPS. In the last week alone, Crossroads GPS announced almost $25 million in advertising against the president and the senators. And the group, Crossroads GPS, has a name, doesn't mean much. They don't have to disclose a single one of their donors. In fact, reports indicate that Crossroads GPS raised $77 million in its first 2 years of existence, and 90% of that came from, at most, 24 donors. That's an average of $2.9 million per donor. So far in this election cycle, as of May 31st, super PACs have spent $135.6 million on electioneering. 20% comes from 501c4 organizations, quote, unquote, social welfare organizations that don't have to declare their donors at all, thanks to the decision at Citizens United. And many of the donors behind the other 80% of super PACs could also be anonymous. That's because people can donate to the 501c4s that require no disclosure, and then the C4s can donate to the 527s, which require some disclosure. The level of disclosure under our present law isn't just inadequate, it's laughable. The voters deserve to know the truth, ugly or not, of who are behind these super PACs. If wealthy special interests want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in our government, well, then they should pay their fair share of taxes rather than fund candidates who will give them special tax breaks paid for by middle-class Americans. Yet, because of the flawed Citizens United ruling, Corporations that can't vote in our elections are trying to buy the electoral outcomes that benefit them, and it's all in secret. Our solution is simple. The Disclose Act simply restores transparency and accountability. There are many of us who would limit what people can give and how they could give it. I believe, frankly, that Buckley v. Vallejo, it's not as bad a decision as Citizens United, but it's a bad decision. I introduced legislation, the constitutional amendment to undo it, years ago. And 2 years ago, I joined my colleague from New Mexico, who had spearheaded this drive in the House, to support his legislation. So I believe there ought to be limits, because the First Amendment is not absolute. No amendment is absolute. You can't scream fire falsely in a crowded theater. We have libel laws. We have anti-pornography laws. All of those are limits on the First Amendment. Well, what could be more important than the wellspring of our democracy and certain limits on First Amendment's rights that, if left unfettered, destroy the equality, any semblance of equality in our democracy, of course would be allowed by the Constitution. And the new theorists on the Supreme Court who don't believe that, I'm not sure where their motivation comes from, but they're just so wrong. They're just so wrong. So, I hope that we're going to move to change this law. I hope we're going to pass first this Disclose Act, then the broader bill that's been introduced, which also has disclaim, and I hope eventually we will find a Supreme Court that allows reasonable limits on campaign contributions. That is so, so important. So, so important for the future. And, Mr. President, I have to tell you, I'm an optimist, and I love this country. We had our DSCC retreat this weekend, and we heard stories about people who had risen from poverty to now run for the U.S. Senate after having careers of great accomplishment. And hearing those stories, I'm not going to name specific individuals. You heard them, Mr. President. They're moving. It's what America's all about. Being there just made me so proud to be an American. And most of our families are examples of this. My father was an exterminator. He didn't go to college. I'm here. What a place. What a place. And despite my love for this country and my fervent belief in its future, the thing that worries me most is the effects of the Citizens United case. To have 17 people contribute half of the money to Republican super PACs, and to have the vast majority of that money undisclosed, is frightening. And, you know, I know maybe our Supreme Court justices say, well, you know, they do think in absolute terms this is the First Amendment. But I'm sure of one thing. None of them having run for office, they have no idea of the power of these negative undisclosed ads and the corrosive effect on our democracy that the influence that those who offer these ads have. It makes me worry about the future of this country. If we continue along this path, and unfortunately the Supreme Court seemed to have very little doubt based on the Montana case where they even refused to hear it, you have to worry about the fundamental fairness of how our system functions. We are not a pure democracy. I understand that. We are a republic if we can keep it. And a republic says that there ought to be some intermediation. There's an understanding in a republic that The Founding Fathers were very much aware of it. I guess Alexander Hamilton, my fellow New Yorker, leading this part of it, that those who have achieved success in America deserve some influence, maybe a little more influence than others. They believe that. And that's how our republic is set up. But the pendulum has swung so far that I truly, for the first time in my life, worry about the future of this democracy. If a small group of people can control the entire political process through the powerful vehicle of undisclosed ads shown on television time and time and time and time again. If when people run for office they're afraid to offend those who have great wealth or power because these ads may be run against them, it presents one of the greatest dangers to this democracy that we've had in over 200 years. I hope this debate may be one of those 9, particularly one of those 5 on the Supreme Court maybe are watching. Do they have some understanding of the damage that this decision is doing to our democracy? Do they understand that when they write, well, we're not against disclosure, that as long as Citizens United continues to exist, it's almost a catch-22, because the way our political structure works, the heavy money that comes in on the other side, and then not a single Republican, even many of those who probably agree with us in their hearts, are willing to vote for even disclosure, means that we'll never get it, and it's an empty promise. Do they understand that the so-called independence of independent expenditures has become a joke? That the very underpinnings of their decision in Citizens United does not square at all with reality that every one of the 100 of us here, the 435 of members of the House on the other side and presidential candidates are living with? Do they have any understanding of that? So here we are. What else can we do? We're here late at night, trying, desperately trying, to either persuade our colleagues whose self-interest mitigates against them joining us, to persuade the people, although the issue of campaign finance is often an abstract one at a time when people are so busy working hard, paying the bills, raising the families, and experiencing the vicissitudes of life that God gives and visits on each and every one of us. Maybe it'll affect one of the justices in the Supreme Court who are sort of living in a fantasy world as their decisions undo the very democracy that they are supposed to preserve. We're trying. That's all we can do. And the one thing I want to assure my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the American people, and everybody else who is involved in this issue, we are not going to stop trying till we succeed. Dr. King, one of the great men of America, said the arc of history is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. The arc of history is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. He was talking about justice for people of color. But there also has to be a justice to average folks who can't reach into their checkbooks and spend $1 million on an ad, undisclosed, that excoriates, often unfairly, someone they disagree with. They need justice too, those average folks. And they're not going to get it till this simple measure and others that are stronger than it start succeeding. So we're going to keep at it. We are not going to stop till we succeed. Under the leadership of many who are here tonight, sitting in this chamber, we will keep working and working and working until our government is truly one of the people, by the people, and for the people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, this is a very interesting night on the Senate floor as many of us keep coming down and talking about what it means and the money involved in politics and the corruptive system that is now plaguing us with these super PACs and these 501c4s, which I would bet you if you ask the average person what's a 501c4, they have no idea. If we said turn on your TV, maybe one of those swing states and see those thousands of ads in the week, well, that's a 501c4, running those ads. But, you know, I'm glad I'm down here this evening. I know it's late. From Alaska's perspective, it's not too late here. It's around 11 o'clock in Washington, D.C. time. Alaska, it's about 7. Sun hasn't set. And here we are in the body talking about what's important to not only to my folks in Alaska, but also to the folks of this country. You know, it's only July, and we're already up to our elbows in negative and dirty and distorted attack ads. Imagine what it will be like by November. These kind of negative ads are cheap shot ads, many of them funded by anonymous donors who make outrageous negative claims based on half-truths at best and outright lies at worst, all paid for by cigarette fat cats and unlimited deep pockets, money that no one knows where it comes from. Alaskans tell me, and when I'm back there, I try to get back there at least twice a month and more, and hear from Alaskans all the time, and they're fed up with it. I know we're fed up with it. I think the American people are fed up with it. So I'm happy to join my colleagues tonight, standing up, fighting back, and demanding transparency. Something so simple. That's all we're asking for tonight. Transparency, openness, and honesty. I mean, I don't know what they're afraid of. You contribute money, you should be proud. You should be excited about who you're supporting. But for some reason, they hide. They don't want people to see who they support. I want to take a few minutes. I know many people have heard tonight who've been watching and listening, and maybe it's been through C-SPAN or through news clips or whatever else might be going on, or through our own websites. Take a few minutes to describe how we got here, why we're in this dilemma. Citizens United case that extended free speech rights to corporations as if they are people. Whoever thought corporate personhood would become part of our vocabulary? In fact, Alaskans are concerned about this. Just last week, the city and borough of Sitka passed a resolution about the opposition to corporate personhood, and I asked unanimous consent to enter this resolution into the record from a small community in Alaska, but concerned about the issue.
Without objection.
I also want to talk about one part of the solution, the reason we are here tonight. A simple solution to a growing problem, and that's the Disclose Act. I notice, as I presided where you were, Mr. President, not long ago, and now I'm down here on the floor, and I noticed no one from the minority is here in this chamber countering or debating what we're talking about tonight. They're home. They're at home, away from the TV cameras, because earlier this evening they voted in a block to vote against moving the Disclose Act forward, which is kind of interesting because I don't know how many times I hear from the other side, please just let us have a right to have a debate on a subject matter. Don't filibuster it. Don't require 60 votes. Let us amend these kinds of issues. So all we're saying is let's get to the vote. They get a chance to amend it if they want, or if they don't like pieces of it, whatever. But they won't let us do that. They voted in favor of unlimited negative political ads. They voted against transparency, openness, and honesty. They voted against the American people. They should be ashamed, and they should be at home hiding. So what exactly is Citizens United? The Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court, again, many of us have talked about it already, 2 years ago, opened up the floodgates to unlimited corporate and special interest money in elections. As a result, corporations and other wealthy interests exert vast influence in our political system through secret, anonymous, untraceable money. Individuals, ordinary Americans, are having their voices drowned out. Super PACs, you hear that phrase off and on, they disclose their donors. But these 501c4s, that's what they call them, 501c4 groups, that's a code underneath the IRS code. The so-called, and they're actually called, this is what's amazing, social welfare organizations. Social welfare organizations, 501c4s. They don't have to disclose anything. They can run their own negative ads, or they can give unlimited money to super PACs without any disclosure. Either way, they don't have to disclose their donors. The era of secret money is here, and it's a lot of money. You've heard the numbers. This year, we estimate almost $1 billion. $1 billion spent in negative ads that no one has to know who's paying for it. If they love these ads, they think they're so great and they're so factual, all we're asking is tell us who you are. Tell us what you're doing. When I was mayor of Anchorage, I had a group like this in one of my re-election campaigns. They ran it. No one knew who they were, but I had a pretty good idea. And I started talking about it. And I'll tell you what happened in Anchorage. People rejected those ads. I won my re-election by one of the largest margins in the city's history. But they started running these secret ads and didn't want to disclose themselves. They didn't like a decision I made. And then they never came forward. But we knew who they were. Again, we think they'll be up to $1 billion. I've already spent $250 million. You know, the last time we had an issue like this in this country around election nearing, in the sense of elections being bought by very special interest groups, it was around 1972. Some people may not remember the history there. But all you have to say is a couple words. Scandal, Watergate. That's what happened. It was election money. More money than people could ever imagine. The rules were unlimited in 72. Matter of fact, it got so bad that it was truly a constitutional crisis. The president had to resign. Think about it. That was the last time we did election reform in the sense of campaign financing. And campaign financing reform came in fast and furious after that because it was the corruption of the money of very few people. It brought down our president at that time and almost brought down this country. Things have changed quite a bit since then. I just want to give you a couple stats because I think it's important to know where we have been and where we are in a sense of this. 40 years ago was the last time we had meaningful, aggressive election in a sense of campaign financing. Back then, you could buy a gallon of gas for 55 cents. Imagine that. HBO was launched as the first pay-for cable network channel or TV station. Today, cable is everywhere, and the amount of money flowing in there to buy these negative ads is enormous. Digital watches were introduced. Everything's digital now. Back then, it was just the beginning. But it was a different era. But we did, after a crisis that occurred with the corruption of money that tried to buy our government, buy every elected official that they could get their hands on, and in that case, the presidency. That was 40 years ago. Here we are. When we think about the money that will be spent this time, $1 billion, almost 70% of the money so far has been used for negative ads. Poll after poll, I don't care if it's a scientific poll or sitting at the coffee shop or when I'm traveling around Alaska, people hate negative ads. But they continue to buy them, and they never want to tell anyone who's paying for them. Again, if they're so proud and they're factual, step to the plate. The election is 4 months away from now, and we're going to see an enormous amount of ads. And when I think about how this affects my state, Alaska. Not so long ago, Alaska had some of the most strictest campaign finance laws in the country. Alaskans said, we don't want outside money or a few rich locals buying elections. Let me give you an example. $500 is a maximum amount you can contribute to a candidate in a calendar year. Individuals, non-residents, the max amount to a governor's race, $20,000 total. Corporations, business organizations, unions in Alaska, prohibited. Groups from outside, not based in Alaska, prohibited. Non-group entities based outside of Alaska, prohibited. We have some of the toughest. But now this effort is stepping on what citizens did through an initiative. What citizens did through an initiative. They put at risk our state laws. Now corporations can make independent expenditures on behalf of state candidates in Alaska, which they could not do before. And our own campaign finance agency in Alaska just issued an opinion that will allow for unlimited spending. This will allow outside groups and outside money to influence Alaskans and Alaskan elections. Exactly what we didn't want through our own citizens initiative. And there's one thing we don't like in Alaska, outsiders telling us how to do our business. They did that for decades. Took everything they could out of Alaska. Every dime, every inch of land they could take in the sense of ownership and mineral resources, they took it all for their benefit. For a few, Alaskans said no more. Not only did we change our laws to govern, we also changed our election laws. Citizens did this. What can we do in Congress? It is so simple. Disclose and transparency. Members of both parties have said for decades that sunlight, as we heard tonight, is the best disinfectant. We need more transparency. I'm a huge advocate for transparency. I post my own schedule. I post my financial statements. I disclose my wife's income, which is not required. I called for crop insurance transparency. I co-sponsored the Stock Act. People just want to know what we're up to. And these corruptive systems of a few, a dozen or so, that are trying to buy this election for their own personal gain. We just want to know who they are. They can spend the money they want, but we just want to know who they are. Transparency, disclosure, used to be a bipartisan idea. Senator McConnell, we heard this earlier, said himself many times, and I want to repeat it because sometimes what happens around this place, I've noticed after only 4 years here, memories get very vague of what people say before, and suddenly they change their ideas based on the politics, not the policy. Here's his direct quote from 15 years ago. I think disclosure is the best disinfectant. I think it gives our constituents an opportunity to decide whether or not we're in the clutches of some particular interest group or whether or not that's a voting issue for them. I'm certainly in favor of enhanced disclosure. That's from the minority leader. Nearly every senator in this body on both sides of this aisle have said they want more transparency. Polls show Americans know exactly who spends money to influence elections, so they want to know it. They want to know it because they want more faith. Maybe this explains why they're angry at us, why Congress has such a low rating. The bill is very simple. I know people have said it over and over again, but sometimes I think we have to repeat it. The bill is very simple. It requires any organization that spends $10,000 or more on influencing politics, they have to file a simple disclosure report with the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. Not complicated. Every group is treated the same. I have received a few emails. I have to say, emails on this issue, all for it, only one against so far. Now, I know once I say this, tomorrow I'll see a ream of them because 5 or 6 of these special interest groups will be churning out, stamped out letters. But the 501, this treats everyone the same. Corporations, nonprofits, labor unions, 501c4s, 527 organizations. They only have to disclose money spent on elections, and only from individuals giving more than $10,000. Under this bill, money given to these groups for other purposes does not need to be disclosed, despite what you read in the paper and the blogs and the misinformation that's put out there, or by the undisclosed groups who tell you the misinformation, who won't tell you who they are, but they want to give you more misinformation. This is a new and improved version of the Disclose Act, which failed on the Senate floor 2 years ago by just 1 vote. Under that bill, the cutoff for disclosure was $600. Now, in this bill tonight, the threshold is $10,000. That's not too much to ask. If you give $10,000 or more for your political attack, negative ads that distort the truth, the American people deserve to know who you are. And if you're so proud of those ads, you should disclose who you are. The bill won't force groups to release their members' list. Despite some people have emailed me, I want to make it very clear. If you belong to the NRA and I belong to the NRA, I'm a lifetime member. Actually, I don't have any problem with the NRA releasing my name. They want to put on their website that I'm a lifetime member, go for it. I'm all for it. I'm proud to be a member. I'm proud to be a member. Put my name up there. But this does not require us, if you're a due-paying member to a group like the NRA, your name won't be listed. So that misinformation that some groups are out there, shame on them. This bill is not an unconstitutional reaction to free speech. The Disclosure Act puts no restrictions on speech and fully consistent with the Supreme Court. The bill also incorporates the court's effective disclosure rules. Let me sum it up. This bill, and I know someone, I think it was Senator from Arkansas today, I saw him and I thought it was great because, you know, we always hear, and, you know, these bills are so big, they're pages. This is it. And if you look at it, it's double-spaced, takes only half the page, each one, not complicated, pretty simple. The bill is narrowly tailored and very, very simple. It doesn't prevent any special interest groups or any corporation from donating any amount they want. All we're asking is just tell us who you are. And when I say us, not us here, the American people who just want to know. The bill will give Americans faith that their elected representatives aren't being bought and sold by hundreds of millions of dollars of secret, untraceable money. So I hope we vote on the Disclosure Act again, and as soon as tomorrow. And I hope my colleagues from the other side come back to this floor. Maybe they will have something to say. I don't know. It's been a long night. They haven't heard a word from them. But it'd be nice to have a debate on this. But also, let's do what I know Alaskans are asking me every day. Clean up the system. The best way you can do that, just tell people where the money, show me the money, follow the money. And when you follow the money, as in 1972 they did, you know exactly who's trying to buy the government. And in this case, we just want to know. And if you're so proud of these ads you run, and I'm sure, we all sat around a little bit talking about this. As soon as we come to the floor and say these things, people will be, I'm sure 2 years from now when I'm up, they'll be thinking I'm going to run those ads against that Begich guy. My view is, hey, if you want to run them, run them. People want to know who you are. But if you want to disclose, then you pay the consequence of what I think Alaskans will feel, and that is these people who hide behind this money, secret money, don't disclose themselves, basically what they're pitching, what they're selling is hogwash. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I'm proud to join so many of my colleagues in speaking